First off, characteristics is not look, and look is not color palette. That's the palette of a typical Blade Runner shot. Bake that info into a LUT, throw it on, still not Blade Runner. Look is production design, lighting, and camera work. Look is created on set in camera. To narrative film, grading is but refinement. This is characteristics of film: exposure levels, color depth, color temperature and saturation, as well as bloom and grain structures. You will learn the 3 main rules of exposure for film. You will understand why film color is deep, as well as basic color temperature and saturation distribution. And you'll see how to add bloom and grain for free. Now, to get the most out of this, watch on a desktop monitor, preferably a calibrated one, and set the highest resolution available in the YouTube player. If you have a recent, decent-sized tablet, those are usually calibrated rather well these days, so that could be an alternative if you do not trust your monitor. The footage I will grade in this tutorial is from Artgrid, who sponsored this video. To learn how Artgrid benefits myself and my work, and can benefit you as a creator, stick around to the end of this video. So, my name is Mark, and this is Basic Characteristics of Film in the Digital Image. Days of Thunder. First of all, I'm recording 2 screens. This is the color work page of Davinci Resolve, and this right here is just a clean output, so I can show you in detail what we're doing with the image. We're going to start with exposure levels. To monitor the exposure levels, we're going to use the waveforms. If yours doesn't look like this, come right here and uncheck colorize, because we do not need the chroma component for what we're doing right now. All we need is luma. We're going to derive our rules for exposure levels from the waveforms and then apply them to our Artgrid footage using the primary wheels right here. So let's start with the highlights. Let's check out where they level. And as we can see right here, surprisingly, they do not level all the way up here at 100% IRE, with the exception of this specular highlight, which is this one right here. That one's obviously 100% white. But in general, the highlights of this image register between 75 and 90% IRE. Not all the way up there as you might have expected. So that's the first rule. We're going to remember: highlights level between 75 and 90% IRE. Next up, skin. And to get a better idea, let me just draw a little power window real quick. So only the skin right here registers on the waveform monitor. This right here are shadows on the skin. Obviously, they register lower. These are highlights of the skin, but the skin midtones, so to speak, they register between 20, let's say, and 50% IRE, with the bulk sitting at like, I'd say 35%. So much lower than you would expect. So that's the second thing we're going to remember. Caucasian skin, like that of Tom Cruise, levels between, let's say, 20 and 50% IRE, with the bulk of the tonal range sitting at about 35%, I'd say. Next up, bulk of the image. So let's undo the power window real quick, come back to the waveform monitor, and we can see something very surprising quite clearly. The bulk of the image sits below the 50% IRE line. And by bulk, I mean like literally, in this case, probably 80, maybe even 85 to 90%. Generally, I would say, and I'm going to show you more examples of this in coming videos, roughly 70% of a filmic image, exposure-wise, sits below 50% IRE. And that is the third rule we're going to remember. To recap, highlights between 75 and 90, skin, Caucasian at least, and I'm going to have Latina and black skin examples in future videos, sits between 20 and 50% IRE, with the bulk coming in at around 35% IRE, and the bulk of the image, 70, 80%, sits below 50. And last but not least, as we can see right here in the waveform monitor, we have nice, dark, deep blacks. Like all this stuff, and the shadow in his face even. This part of his helmet. all of this has nice, dark, completely black parts. Having deep, dark blacks is not technically an exposure rule. It's just something that comes with this exposure technique. Still something to remember. Nice, dark, deep blacks. And now that we have derived our 3 basic rules for exposure by monitoring with the waveform, let's apply these rules to our Artgrid footage using the primary wheels. Okay, sticking with the racing theme, going from one race car driver to the other. This is our Artgrid footage. Let's take care of the white balance real quick. I'm just gonna use this automatically. Boom, there we go. Before, after, nice. Now let's apply our exposure levels. Highlights first, using the primary wheels right here. Gain, this is the highlights. And let's bring them down to right between 75 and 90%. Before, after, before, after. Let's check out where the skin levels. And as we can see right here, it levels all right. A bit dark, but he's in the shadows more so than Tom Cruise's skin, so I'd say that already levels pretty well. Let's get rid of that power window. Bulk of the image? No, with this one it's like 60%, 65% by my estimation. Not like before where it was like 80 to 85%, but the image looks different. So I'd say in case of this footage right here, that's all right. But we have to take care of one last thing, and that's getting our nice dark deep blacks. Yeah. Let's really shove them down there. Yeah. Before, after. Before, after. Check out the waveforms. Boom. Too high? Nice. All right. Highlights, 75 to 90. Skin, between 20 and 50. Maybe more like 20 than 50. Then again, there's more shadow on this skin than right here. So that actually makes sense. Overall, nice, dark, deep areas right here. Back of his head, top of the car. Yeah. Before, after. Before, after. Exposure levels corrected. Next up, color temperature. We're going to check the color temperature in 3 different areas of the image: highlights, midtones, and shadows. I'll come all the way over here to the bottom left corner, get the white balance eyedropper tool, and just use this little thing, because it'll show me RGB values for every pixel I basically hover this thing over. Right now, I'm in the highlights, because this thing hovers over the sky. And as we can see, red 191, green 195, blue 200. Makes sense because it's the sky and there's a lot of atmosphere between the viewer and the sky, so a blue tint is natural. Then again, the stadium isn't far enough away to be tinted blue. This distance is not enough for a blue tint. Still, red 182, green 186, blue 189. Slightly bluish tint, and this tells me that the film material itself renders highlights slightly blue, which for a film is common. Let's check out the midtones. Obviously, Mr. Cruise here is wearing a white suit, but as we can see right here, red 132, green 127, blue 123, slightly warm tint as opposed to the slightly cool tint of the highlights. Interesting. Now let's come to Mr. Randy Quaid's coat, I'd say. Red 17, green 14, blue 9. Again, slightly warm tint. So to summarize, highlights, slightly cool, midtones and shadows, slightly warm, which makes sense because the midtones and the shadows carry the skin, and the highlights usually carry the sky, windows, or walls, or whatever. So this natural color temperature distribution of film always pits the skin against the background, which separates both of those nicely. Once again, let's apply what we've learned. Alt-S, new node, right-click that node, node label, CT for color temperature. Now there's many ways to push red or orange into the shadows and midtones, respectively blue into the highlights. Here's how I do it. I come right here, go to log, and now under the log controls for shadows, midtones, and highlights, I have color controls. Red, green, blue for all of the areas. So I'm just going to start pushing red into the shadows, and we're going to watch on the clean out what happens. First, let me just overdo it so you see what's going on. This is pushing reds into the shadows. That's a bit much. It's still a bit much. That actually looks fine. Before, after. Pay close attention to the skin. Before, after. Before, after. Okay, let's do the same thing with the midtones. Again, I'm just going for red. Watch the skin. Watch the skin. Overdoing it, of course. And then dialing it back to... Well, 15 looked good, actually. Maybe 20. Yeah. Before, after. Before, after. Now, we've introduced red into all of the shadows, but we want to keep our shadows clean. So we're coming right here to the curves, and we're selecting the luminance versus saturation curve. We're going to click the black point. We're going to desaturate the blacks. And now we're going to move this left and right to see when we get what we want. Check out this hairline and the skin. This is too much. This is too much in the other direction. This is right. So now the alteration we did for the skin is in effect, but we're getting nice clean blacks right here. Again, before, after, before, after. Now let's do the same thing with the highlights. So I'm pushing blue into them. Again, overdoing it at first. And then dialing it back to right around here. Looks good. Now before, after, before, after. Again, pay attention to how clearly now the skin is pitted against the outside of the car. The skin having a very warm color temperature, the outside of the car having a cool one. Really helps to separate the two. Next up, color saturation. To check what's what, we're going to use the vector scope. Come right here and uncheck colorize because chroma isn't important right now. What we're looking for is the relative saturation levels between low or shadows, mid or midtones, and high or highlights. If you go to low, all that shows up on the vector scope is the saturation levels for the shadows. They're pretty much skewed towards red mostly and a bit yellowish, pretty much on the skin tone line. Mid, same thing, slightly more yellowish. High, again, same thing, in this case, slightly red yellowish tint. But the main difference is this. Absolute levels of saturation, low compared to mid, pretty much the same. Just scoot towards yellow in case of the midtones. But if I go to the highlights, much less saturation. So rule number one when it comes to saturation, the highlights are slightly desaturated compared to the shadows and midtones. Number two, overall saturation of the image actually isn't very high. The colors aren't saturated in a filmic image, they are deep. Saturation means adding more of the same color to the color. Just for fun, let's up the saturation to show you what I mean. This is what happens when you saturate the color. This is not a filmic look. This is a commercial look at best. Saturation, as I just said, means adding more of the same color to the color, which makes the appearance more vibrant. Color depth is determined by how much black or white you add to the hue. In film, black or white means adding light or shadow. And since, as we already know, the bulk of the image is exposed below 50% IRE, we're adding a lot of black to most colors in the image, which makes them deep, rich, and heavy. So the key to filmic color has nothing to do with saturation. It has everything to do with the right exposure level. Just for fun, let's use the offset command and add more black. See how this changes the color? See how this makes it even more deep in case of lowering the exposure, or makes it lighter in case of upping the exposure, respectively adding more white. This is completely different from adding or decreasing saturation. To recap, rule number 1 when it comes to saturation, shadows and midtones are more saturated compared to the highlights, which are less saturated compared to the midtones and shadows. Overall saturation is low. It is never pushed with classic traditional filmic images. The key to filmic color is not saturation. The key is correct exposure levels to make the color deep, rich, and heavy. That's the look of color in film. Alright, you know the drill. Alt-S, new node, right-click that node, node label, label that node, set for saturation, and then what we need to do is come to curves and select the luminance versus saturation curve. This allows me to change the saturation for the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. Just so you know what's going on, this would happen if I did increase the midtone saturation. This is what would happen if I decreased the midtone saturation. I want to do none of these things. All I want is highlights that are slightly desaturated compared to the shadows and midtones. This is super simple. I just click the white point. I drag this down, making sure I'm not killing my blue hue. Before, after, before, after, this is almost doing nothing, but should highlights, extreme highlights, emerge during the shot at a later time, they will be, by definition, slightly desaturated. I might even come to like 60%. And I might move this a bit more into the midtones. Not too much though, because I do not want to lose my bluish highlight tint. That's it. Highlights are now slightly desaturated compared to the midtones and shadows. Glow is another very film-specific effect. In this still from the film, you can see it in effect right here on the practical lights on the ceiling. It seems like the light of the practicals spills over into the surrounding areas, resulting in a loss of contrast and increased brightness around these light sources on the ceiling. You can also see it in effect right here around the windows. It's just one of the effects that are due to the nature of actual film stock. Luckily for us, it's easily replicable in both the studio as well as the free version of Davinci Resolve using the OpenFX panel. Alright, Alt-S, new node, right-click, node label, GL for glow, and then come up here to the OpenFX tab, start typing glow, GL already does it, drag and drop the glow effect onto the new node. And now let's turn it on and off to see the before and after. This is what it does right now, and it's a bit harsh. So let's adjust this effect. Usually I start by just showing the shiny regions and then adjusting the shine threshold. This is too much. Less is more with this effect in general. So that's about right. And as you can see right here, there's going to be a bit of glow outside the car, which makes sense because the sky is pretty bright and we're watching through a window. And there's going to be a bit of glow right here on his suit because light hits it directly and it is pretty much white. Next up, I'm going to check out glow alone. And there's a myriad of options that you can alter. Usually I restrict myself to shine, threshold, and brightness. So I might alter the threshold a little. Might give it a bit more, just like this. Looks fine. And then I go to glowing image, adjusting the brightness a bit. Too much, too little. Actually, well, around 0.5 wasn't so bad. Once again, let's check what it does. Yeah. Before, after. Before, after. It's really minimal, and granted, it doesn't do a whole lot for this image, but in future videos, there's one that I'm going to do with a dancer. You will see that in other scenarios, glow makes a tremendous difference and seriously elevates the aesthetics of the image. Right here, as I said, doesn't do a whole lot, just gives it a little kick. Alright, last but not least, grain structure. Different types of film have different structures, like 8mm film has a pretty severe grain structure, 35mm film has a pretty smooth structure. Then again, it's different from digital compression, so it's actually hard to show you exactly what I mean with this still right here, because it's a highly compressed digital image. But if we zoom in to like 200% and just let the clip roll, you might be able to see what I mean. Right? This is the remnants, at least, below the digital compression of the actual film grain. And that's what we're going to add now as the final effect to our shot. Now, if you own the studio version of Resolve, you could simply add another node, right-click, label it GR for grain, for example, open the Open Effects panel, type grain, and drag and drop the film grain effect onto your node, and then choose whatever effect you want, 8mm, 16mm, 35mm, custom. Now, if you don't want to spend $300 on the studio version of Resolve, here's how you can do it for free. So let's remove this node, close the effects panel, come back to the edit page. Because you can download film grain overlays, 8mm, 16mm, and 35mm off the internet for free. Link in the description. Now, 8mm course looks like this. And in this case, I have to remove the audio track. I don't know why they put that in there. Adjust the clip length of the grain clip to fit your clip. And then this is what's going to be overlaid. And as I said, 8mm have a pretty severe grain structure. It's going to be quite a dramatic effect. Now, of course, this is not what we want. We have to come to composite mode and select, you might have guessed it, overlay. Et voila, there we go. Now this is before, and this is after. Before, after. Before, after. Now if you're producing for a pretty small end medium, like a smartphone, you might as well choose 8mm overlays, because on a small screen the effects of film grain are reduced. If you're producing for the desktop, this might actually be a bit too much. You could reduce the opacity to like 50%, which reduces the effect. Or you could simply choose a different overlay, like 35mm coarse or fine. Same MO. In this case, get rid of the audio track, adjust the clip length, and now you can see we're getting a much finer grain structure. Again, composite mode to overlay, and there we go. After, before, after, before, after. Again, if it's too much for us, we can adjust the opacity of the grain clip. I like 35mm cores, so this is where I'm gonna leave it be. Also, if the film overlay grain clip isn't long enough to match the clip you want to use it on, you can simply copy it because no one's gonna notice the transition between the two film grain overlay clips. Okay, there we go. That's the video. Before, after. Before, after. Digital, film. Digital, film. Now this is not a look. Again, this is characteristics. Digital characteristics, film characteristics. Let's run it. This is digital. This is film. Correct exposure levels, correct color temperature and saturation distributions, glow and grain structure. Alright, thanks for sticking around. First of all, some basic knowledge that applies to basically any kind of subscription service out there. If you don't have a concept or an idea of how to make back the money you spend on a subscription service, I say it's too early for you to pay for one. But if your YouTube channel or social media presence does generate some income, or you do already do a bit of client work, you can then start to think about how to invest some of that money as opposed to just spending it. Now here's how Artgrid benefits my work and myself. Number 1, regular stock footage. I recently shot an infomercial about a water filtration / ionizing system. Basically, it's an elaborate sales pitch and the guy talks about many different aspects of water. Hydration during sports activities, pollution of the oceans through plastic waste, the importance of clean water for cooking and growing vegetables and fruit, nutrition in general, how pure water ties in with a clean lifestyle, and so on. Now he wants imagery for all of this. However, budget caps out at a 2-day shoot. Stock footage really is the only answer because no one in their right mind would ever pay me for getting those kinds of shots, even if I had the time and they had the money. Number 2, example footage for pitching projects. I found that referencing popular films or commercials is problematic because they come with their own mythology and non-film, non-video people just seem to have a hard time really abstracting the aesthetics from the narrative. It's more ballast than helpful in my experience. For example, we're shooting a commercial for dentures for the elderly. Part of that is them having a great day doing different activities. I just got stock footage of Artgrid that fit the look and feel of what we were shooting for. Then grabbed some stills and just put them right in the pitch. None of that footage carries widespread popular narrative mythology, so the client can look at this and just get the aesthetic idea, which helps communication a lot, therefore helps everybody involved. Number 3, learning color correction and grading. If you want to learn color correction and grading, spoiler alert, you have to do it a lot. Grading the same shots differently multiple times is a helpful exercise to a point. But if you really want to put in your 10,000 hours, you need lots and lots of footage on a regular basis. And not just that, it has to be stuff that you crave to grade, that makes you look forward to grading, makes you excited about grading. You got a snowball's chance in hell of shooting all that footage by yourself. Now Artgrid's premium option includes raw and log footage, which is awesome for learning color correction and grading. It just keeps you excited about grading because you're getting your hands on tons of footage shot by cameras most people can't afford, in some cases can't even afford to rent. And the selection just keeps growing. It saves you time and money on your way to becoming proficient, excellent even, in color correction and grading. On top of that, Artgrid are currently holding an editing challenge with prizes and filmmaking gear worth 35 grand. It's a great opportunity if you're into this thing and to get into Artgrid. The challenge ends September 20th, 2020, so if you want to enter, get right to it. And finally, if you want Artgrid yourself, please consider subscribing through the links in the video description. I get a commission which helps me to keep the whole YouTube thing going, and you get 2 months of Artgrid for free. That's it for this video. If you have movie recommendations for the next videos of this series, please let me know in the comments. If you liked the video, if you found it helpful, please make sure to leave a thumbs up, it's greatly appreciated. Any kind of comment or feedback is welcome and I'll try to answer as quickly as possible. All the tech that I've used in this video is linked in the description. As always, thank you so much for your time, thank you for watching, and hopefully see you again soon.
One shot, now the future is yours, go! I'm turning dreams into reality. In the lab with the formula and chemistry. New memories spark and motivate and make the industry shake. We put the bars in the brakes. I'm talking one chance at best, yes. Painting pictures for the culture, keep the brushes fresh. Flip the drummer, work the drummer, passion never rests. Freedom is our teacher under pressure, now we blessed.